Aten heretic Aten resul.
They came at night, not enemies from foreign lands, but Egypt's own soldiers. Faces painted in ceremonial gold, blades drawn beneath moonlight. No war drums, no warning, just the sound of sandals crushing the temple stones and the silence that comes before a world falls apart. By sunrise, 3 cities were already burning. In Memphis, cloaked figures stormed the sacred temples. Priests, men who had once held the ears of kings, were dragged from sanctuaries and nailed to the doors of their own shrines. The cries of pain mingled with the chants of zealots, echoing through pillars that had stood for generations. In Thebes, the great library of Thoth, a repository of knowledge older than kingdoms, was stripped of its scrolls. Hundreds of papyri were tossed into the Nile, their ink bleeding into the water like veins across a corpse. Flames licked the library walls, and the symbols of ancient power turned to ash. In Abydos, the tombs of gods and kings were desecrated. Statues of Osiris, Amun, Horus, and Isis were shattered beneath the boots of soldiers who once prayed to them. Children watched in horror as idols fell, and mothers clutched their babies, whispering forbidden prayers they no longer dared to speak aloud. The holiest order in human history was collapsing, not from invasion, not from rebellion, but from command. Across the Nile Valley, Egypt bled. Temples were closed. Offerings ceased. The names of gods, once etched in granite, sung in hymns, and whispered in birth and death, were outlawed. Stone masons, once craftsmen of praise, were now executioners of memory. They chiseled divine names from tombs, defaced sacred texts, and erased gods from history. Those who resisted disappeared. Some were imprisoned. Others, never seen again. Food began to dwindle. Crops failed. With the priesthood destroyed and offerings ended, famine crept across the land like a shadow. The borders were left undefended. The armies, once protectors of the realm, now marched through cities not to guard, but to punish, to purge. This was no longer Egypt as its people had known it. This was something new. A campaign not of conquest, but of annihilation. A cleansing, a purge of heaven itself. And still, in every village, every city, every heart, the question haunted the people. Who commanded this? Not the high priests, they were crucified. Not the generals, they were silent. Not even the gods, they were gone. The answer came not from the battlefield, but from the throne. From deep within the palace of Akhenaten, a man emerged. A silhouette robed in sunlight, crowned not by gold, but by divine claim. His skin glowed like sun-warmed stone. His features were strange, sharp and stretched. His voice, calm, cold, unwavering. He did not speak of power. He spoke of purity. He did not call for conquest. He spoke of the truth. He declared the gods of Egypt to be lies, every single one false. And in their place, he exalted a single god, a disk of fire, a celestial eye. The Aten, not many gods, just one. One God, one light, one Pharaoh. And in that moment, Akhenaten was born. His name would come to mean effective for the sun disk. But his war, a war against centuries of belief, tradition, and empire, had already begun. This is not myth. This is not a parable carved in forgotten tombs. This is the true story of a heretic Pharaoh, who destroyed 1,000 gods to exalt one, who built a city of light in a land turned to shadow, and whose name would be chiseled out of memory, damned by his heirs, buried by his nation, all in an attempt to erase the most radical revolution in religious history. But history has a way of remembering what kings try to silence. and Akhenaten's forbidden legacy still burns, waiting to be uncovered. Before we go into that history buried under sand, ash, and silence, stories that were never meant to survive, subscribe to Unique History Alive. Because here, the dead don't just whisper, they scream their truth. On this channel, we don't just tell you what happened. We show you why it mattered, who hid the truth, and what the world lost when history was rewritten. From blood-stained temples to banned scrolls, from warrior queens whose names were burned from memory, to emperors erased by their enemies. We breathe life into the past, one uncovered secret at a time. Before Akhenaten dared to erase the gods, Egypt stood as a beacon of divine order. For nearly 2 millennia, the Nile had nourished not just the land, but the very soul of a civilization. From the pyramids of Giza to the temples of Karnak, from the tombs of Valley of the Kings to the shrines of Abydos, Egypt was more than an empire. It was a sacred machine. Every stone, every ritual, every heartbeat calibrated to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic balance between chaos and order. And at the center of it all were the gods. Amun, king of the gods, ruled over wind and creation. Wrath, the sun god, soared across the sky in his solar bark. Isis, the mother goddess, governed life and magic. Osiris, lord of the afterlife, judged the dead. Horus, falcon-headed son of Isis, guarded the throne. These were not distant deities. They were living presences. Every sunrise was Rav's rebirth. Every flood was a gift from Hapi. Every pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but the living embodiment of Horus, a divine bridge between gods and mortals. And no place reflected that divine connection more than Thebes. By the 18th dynasty, around 1350 BCE, Thebes had become the beating heart of Egypt's empire. Towering over the eastern bank of the Nile, its skyline shimmered with white limestone obelisks and colonnades of the vast Karnak and Luxor temples. The great god Amun was worshipped with processions of gold, incense, and sacred boats. His priesthood was unmatched in wealth, influence, and reach. These priests did not just serve the gods. They advised pharaohs, collected taxes, commanded workers, and controlled massive temple estates that rivaled the power of the crown itself. In some ways, Egypt was a dual monarchy, ruled in name by Pharaoh, but in spirit and ritual by the clergy of Amun. And at the height of Egypt's golden age, the empire stretched further than it ever had before. Under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, Egypt had become a superpower. Its armies thundered across Canaan and Syria. Its merchant fleets sailed to Punt and Crete. Foreign princes sent tribute. Others sent daughters, eager to secure alliances. Gold from Nubia poured into the temples. Art flourished. Monuments soared. Egypt was not merely admired. It was feared. But beneath this glittering surface, cracks had begun to form. Amenhotep III had ruled for nearly 4 decades, a king of luxury and splendor. But in his later years, he grew increasingly withdrawn, obsessed with his cult of the sun god Re, and more open to mystical advisors. Rumors swirled about court corruption, growing priestly arrogance, and the whispers of new ideas taking root behind palace walls. There were signs, faint but unmistakable, that a new wind was blowing, and its source was a young prince named Amenhotep I. Not much is known about Amenhotep I's early life, because those who came after him tried to destroy every trace. But what little survives tells us he was no ordinary child. Unlike his war-hardened ancestors, he was raised in the intellectual crucible of the royal court, surrounded by scribes, astronomers, and mystics. His mother, Queen T, was no passive consort. She was the first great queen to wield power publicly, and some believe she shaped her son's spiritual outlook far more than his father did. While Egypt's elite bowed to Amun, The young prince seemed drawn to a different source of light, Aten, the solar disk. More abstract than Re, more distant than Amun. Aten had long existed in Egyptian theology, but only as a symbol, not a standalone god. Yet something in its blinding singularity called to him. To Amenhotep I, Aten was not a symbol. He was the truth. And in the secret chambers of the palace, away from the towering statues and incense of Thebes, a new faith was beginning to take form. The shape of the world before the storm. To understand the fire Akhenaten would unleash, we must understand the world he set ablaze. Egypt was polytheistic, a world of hundreds of gods, each tied to local cults, rituals, and natural phenomena. Every region had its patron deity. Every town had its temple. Religion was not belief, it was infrastructure, the very glue that held Egypt together. The priesthood was powerful, second only to the king. They controlled not just temples, but land, labor, and law. Challenging them was challenging Egypt itself. Pharaohs were divine, but also custodians, expected to honor tradition and uphold Maat. A ruler could innovate in architecture or conquest, but religion, that was sacred ground. And so when a young king, soft-spoken, thin-faced, with strange features and a distant gaze, began to rise in court, no one suspected what he would become. Amenhotep I was not a warrior, he was not a builder, he was not a conqueror, but he would become the most radical pharaoh in Egyptian history. He would rename himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. He would move the capital, build a city from nothing, wage war on gods, and reshape Egyptian theology with a single stroke. His reign would last only 17 years, but his legacy would be feared for centuries, and those who came after him would do everything in their power to erase him. But how do you erase a man who tried to replace heaven itself? The ascension of Amenhotep IV was not heralded with fanfare. There were no epic battles, no foreign kings slain, no great monuments erected in his name, at least not at first. To the court of Thebes, he was a quiet successor, a dutiful son following in the long shadow of Amenhotep III, the king of gold, who had filled the temples of Amun with unimaginable wealth and prestige. His coronation was orthodox, his lineage divine, and his intentions, so they believed, aligned with Egypt's gods. But within the walls of the palace, change had already begun. Even before the public realized it, Amenhotep IV had begun to sidestep the Amun priesthood, Egypt's most powerful institution outside the crown. He limited their access to royal funds. He commissioned new temples, but not for Amun. Instead, he began building open-air shrines, radiant, roofless structures, aligned to the rising sun. These were not dark, incense-choked sanctuaries like those of Amun. They were designed to bathe in light, and at their center was not a statue, not a relic, but a sun disk, the Aten. What began as subtle deviation became bold defiance. He ordered images of himself and his family, worshipping the Aten, to be carved into public spaces, always with outstretched arms toward the radiant disk above, never bowing to Amun, never invoking the old gods. The clergy watched in growing unease. So did the generals. So did the people. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV did something no pharaoh had done in 1,000 years. He changed his name. He was no longer Amenhotep. Amun is pleased. He would now be called Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. It was more than a personal declaration. It was a declaration of war against tradition, against the gods, against Egypt itself. And to make that war visible to all, Akhenaten took the unthinkable next step. He abandoned Thebes, the spiritual and political capital of Egypt, and ordered the construction of an entirely new city. On a stretch of untouched desert, halfway between Memphis and Thebes, Akhenaten raised his masterpiece from the sand. Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. It rose like a mirage from nothing. Within just 3 years, thousands of workers, craftsmen, artists, soldiers, and slaves had created a new capital. Streets were carved in perfect symmetry. Temples stood wide and roofless, designed to flood with sunlight. Palaces gleamed with imported stone. Murals adorned every wall, depicting Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti as divine figures in constant communion with the Aten. The city pulsed with propaganda. Gone were the jackal-headed gods, the falcon-headed deities, the ancient hymns of Osiris. In their place were sunrays ending in open hands, the Aten touching Pharaoh's face directly. And always, always, the royal family stood alone beneath the sun, bathed in divine favor. Even Nefertiti, his queen, was no longer just consort. She was co-regent, goddess-like in poise and power. Together, they ruled not only Egypt, but the very access to the divine. There were no intermediaries, no priests. Only the royal bloodline stood between the people and the Aten. To the priests of Amun, this was not eccentricity, it was apostasy. The temples of Thebes, once overflowing with tribute and power, had become tombs, their voices silenced, their offerings cut off, their gods defaced. Some resisted in whispers, others in secrecy, but resistance would not be tolerated. Akhenaten dispatched royal enforcers to purge the realm of the old gods. These were not symbolic reforms, they were violent, coordinated acts. Temples of Amun were closed or destroyed. Statues were smashed, inscriptions were erased, priests were imprisoned or executed, scrolls deemed heretical were burned. Families were torn apart for hiding icons of Isis or keeping relics of Horus. In Nubia, rebellion stirred. In Syria, border garrisons found themselves under attack from vassals who sensed weakness. Diplomats pleaded with Akhenaten to respond, to defend Egypt's empire, but the pharaoh refused to be distracted. He was fighting a different war, not over land, but over heaven. For ordinary Egyptians, life became disorienting. Generations had lived by the rhythm of offerings, festivals, funerary rites, and prayers. Now those rituals were gone. Entire towns found themselves without temples. Scribes no longer inscribed the Book of the Dead. Funeral customs collapsed. Farmers feared droughts without Hapi's blessing. Mothers whispered prayers to Hathor in secret. The people did not understand this new god, a faceless disk in the sky. He had no stories, no myths, no sacred beasts. He did not love, rage, or guide. He simply shined, and the only ones who could speak to him were Akhenaten and Nefertiti. It was not a religion, it was a monarchy of light. And in it, the pharaoh was no longer just a ruler. He was the only conduit to divinity. Even Egypt's art transformed under Akhenaten. Gone were the rigid, idealized images of kings and gods. In their place, a strange new realism emerged. Bulbous heads, narrow eyes, elongated limbs, full lips, intimate family scenes. The royal family was portrayed with affection, even vulnerability. Akhenaten kissing his daughters, Nefertiti holding infants, all under the gentle rays of Cunnan. To some, it was revolutionary, human, tender, spiritual. To others, it was disturbing, unnatural, heretical. Many historians today believe these depictions may reflect medical conditions, or perhaps symbolic transcendence, that the royal family was no longer bound by mortal proportions. Regardless, the art of Akhenaten signaled a world untethered from Egypt's past. It was a redefinition of identity, and it extended to every corner of society. As the years passed, Akhenaten's obsession deepened. He withdrew further into his palace. Nefertiti vanished from records, perhaps dead, perhaps exiled. One by one, his children died, and Akhenaten buried them in silence. He refused to leave Akhenaten, even as the empire unraveled. Hittites threatened the northern borders. Libyans tested the west. Egypt's colonies rebelled, and allies pleaded for aid. But the pharaoh consumed by ritual, ignored it all. He had eyes only for the Aten. To his court, he seemed less like a ruler and more like a prophet king. A man in communion with something no one else could see, a god in his own eyes, a heretic in theirs. When famine struck and the Nile failed to flood, many blamed the abandonment of the old gods. Secret cults emerged. Priests gathered in hiding. Soldiers began deserting. The dream of a sunlit kingdom had become a nightmare in daylight. And then in his 17th year, and then he was gone. There was no royal decree, no announcement, no funerary procession, no final edict from the throne. The palace doors remained closed. The sunlight still rose over Akhenaten, but its god-king no longer stepped into it. Had he died quietly, surrounded by mourning courtiers? Had he been overthrown in the shadows, poisoned, silenced, or had he simply vanished, swallowed by the very god he worshipped? History offers no clear answer. His tomb, if it ever existed, remains uncertain. What is certain is this: Akhenaten ceased to exist, and into the silence he left behind, chaos descended. No grand procession, no triumphal death mask, no tomb that survived the ages. His body was likely buried in the cliffs near Akhenaten, but even that has never been proven. Some say his tomb was looted. Others believe it was destroyed deliberately. What followed was not a smooth succession. It was a reckoning. His immediate successors, a frail boy named Smenkhkare, and perhaps later Tutankhaten, would attempt to restore order, and with them came retribution. A vengeance not just of politics, but of faith. The silence left by Akhenaten was not peace. It was the hush that comes before the collapse, the brief stillness before a kingdom begins to scream. With the sun god's prophet vanished, and no heir clearly established, the world Akhenaten built, his radiant empire of light, began to rot from within. What rose to replace him was not order, but confusion, desperation, and vengeance. Akhenaten, once the blazing capital of monotheism, now stood hollow. The sandstone palaces shimmered under the same sun, but the laughter was gone. The rituals stopped. The priests of Aten, once so confident in their divine authority, wandered like ghosts, ignored, spit on, or executed. The people began to flee. Merchants returned to Memphis. Laborers deserted the city in the night. Courtiers whispered prayers to Osiris again. In hiding, the sacred avenue, where Akhenaten and Nefertiti once paraded under the sun's rays, lay cracked and dusty, its golden murals fading. Worse still, the Nile had failed to flood properly again. Famine, long feared, became real. Children died in their mothers' arms. Priests of the old gods said the cause was clear. The gods were angry. They had been betrayed, forgotten, and now they would return. Not with forgiveness, but with fire. The whispers of heresy were becoming cries for retribution. The throne sat empty, or so it appeared. In the confusion that followed Akhenaten's disappearance, a new figure stepped forward, Smenkhkare. To this day, no one knows who he truly was. Some say a younger brother. Others claim a son. Some even argue it was Nefertiti herself, taking the throne under a male persona. But whoever he was, his reign was brief, barely a year. Little is known, because the records were intentionally destroyed. All that remains is a name and its sudden erasure. What came next would change everything. A child king, born of royal blood, barely 9 years old. His name, Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, but not for long. Within the first 2 years of his reign, the child king's name was changed. Quietly at first, then officially, in stone, in ceremony, in decree. He would now be known as Tutankhamen, living image of Amen. It was the single most symbolic act since Akhenaten's rise, and it carried the weight of a revolution. Temples of Amen reopened across Thebes. Priests returned in force, flanked by scribes and guards. Shrines to Aten were closed. then ransacked. The city of Akhenaten was ordered abandoned. Workers stripped it bare, columns collapsed, walls crumbled. Its sacred stones were reused to build new temples to the old gods. It had taken Akhenaten 17 years to build a new world. It took his successors less than 5 to bury it. But this was more than a political shift. It was holy vengeance. The priesthood of Ammon had lost everything under Akhenaten. Now they wanted it back, and they wanted blood. Their campaign wasn't just restoration. It was exorcism. Akhenaten's name was chiseled off every monument, obliterated from cartouches, scratched from tombs. His images, already strange, elongated, divine, were hacked apart, buried in pits, or defaced. Even in the royal necropolises, guards were sent to destroy the tombs of his loyal followers. The very word Aten was outlawed in public inscriptions. It was not enough to reject him. He had to be erased. This wasn't political vengeance. It was religious purification. The goal was simple, to make it as though Akhenaten had never existed. While priests hunted statues in the heartland, the empire's edges were burning. In Canaan, vassal kings, who had once sent tribute to Egypt, now declared independence. In Syria, Hittite armies moved south, claiming Egyptian forts and trade routes. In Nubia, local rulers began arming themselves, breaking old treaties. Egypt, once the most powerful empire in the known world, was now fractured. Why? Because while Akhenaten had been worshipping the sun, he had abandoned the sword. He had sent no armies, reinforced no borders, received no envoys, responded to no pleas. In one surviving letter, a desperate prince from Byblos writes, "Send chariots, send men. If you do not come, we will be taken. Do not abandon us, my Pharaoh, my Lord of Light." No reply was ever found. By the time Tutankhamun's generals tried to retake those lands, the damage was done. Egypt had lost its grip. Even as temples filled once more with incense and hymns, the people could not forget. Akhenaten had changed them. He had spoken of unity, of light, of one truth. And in doing so, he had opened a wound between the people and their gods. The priesthood demanded silence, but questions lingered. What if he was right? What if the gods were false? What if the sun, faceless and eternal, was the only true divinity? In secret, some still kept small tokens, amulets, fragments, a chiseled stone with the Aten's rays. In rural tombs, buried deep, archaeologists would later find hybrid burials, old gods mixed with Atenic imagery. His revolution had failed, but his influence lingered. After Tutankhamun's early death, still a mystery to this day, power passed to a general, Horemheb. He was not born of royal blood. He was not a prophet. He was a soldier, and his mission was absolute. Stabilize Egypt, erase the past, crush the heresy. Akhenaten's temples were ground to rubble. Loyalists were executed or exiled. Scribes were ordered to produce new king lists, ones that skipped Akhenaten entirely. To the official record, Egypt had gone from Amenhotep III straight to Horemheb. A 17-year reign was reduced to silence. He had become a ghost pharaoh. By the end of Horemheb's reign, the Aten had vanished from public life. The sun still rose, but no one dared name it. Akhenaten had become a ruin. Akhenaten's body, if it had ever been buried, was never found. The pharaoh who once declared war on 1,000 gods was now a phantom in the sand. But history, like the Nile, never stays buried forever. When the sun finally set on the reign of Akhenaten, Egypt did not return to its former self. It pretended to, but something had broken. The trauma of one man's attempt to erase the divine order had scarred the kingdom in ways it could not immediately name. The temples were reopened. The hymns were restored. The statues of Amun once again raised high into the desert sky. But beneath the public rituals and official proclamations, Egypt was a kingdom walking across shattered glass. What had begun as a spiritual revolution ended as a national identity crisis. And into this wreckage stepped Horemheb, general, regent, restorer. Horemheb was not born to royalty. He was a career military man, once entrusted with Egypt's foreign policy under Tutankhamun, a pragmatic, iron-willed commander. He had watched the empire unravel during the chaos of the Aten years. Unlike Akhenaten, he did not believe in dreams. He believed in order, military, political, and divine. When he seized the throne, he did not do so by prophecy or divine right. He did so by force and necessity. Akhenaten's legacy is not just what he changed, but what he forced the world to confront. Today, his story matters more than ever. In a world divided by faith, by ideology, by competing truths, Akhenaten's life reminds us of the power and peril of belief, of what happens when one man dares to reshape the spiritual DNA of a civilization. He teaches us that truth, imposed by force, becomes tyranny, that purity, when demanded, leads to ruin. That vision without compassion destroys not only tradition, but lives. But he also reminds us that the human spirit, in all its courage and madness, will always reach beyond the visible, that there is something eternal in the attempt to find meaning in the light. He ruled for less than 2 decades. He built a city the world forgot. He turned his back on 1,000 gods and dared to name just one. And for that, they tried to erase him. But Akhenaten was more than a pharaoh, more than a heretic, more than a man. He was a question, a wound in time, a warning etched in broken stone. Empires fall, temples crumble, names fade. But some stories, the ones too dangerous to be remembered, never truly disappear. They survive in silence, in sand, in the shadows between faith and doubt. And so, as the sun sets over the ruins of his city, one truth remains. You can destroy the memory of a man, but you can't erase the light he brought with him. Akhenaten's Egypt was a kingdom set on fire by its own god. And from that fire, we inherit a question that still lingers beneath every temple, every throne, every nation that dares to define truth. What happens when the sun becomes your only god, and he stops shining? This was not a myth. This was not a dream. This was real. This was Egypt. This was Akhenaten, the pharaoh they tried to erase. But some shadows, even the sun cannot burn away. What you just watched wasn't just history. It was a voice that refused to be forgotten. And there are so many more waiting to be heard. So if you felt something today, if the past reached out and touched you, then don't let it fade. Subscribe to Unique History Alive and walk with us, one buried truth at a time. Because history isn't dead. It's just been waiting for someone like you.